So just please be mindful that today's session is recorded. Please feel free as we're going throughout the session to use that chat box to ask questions. I want this particular training to be super applicable to you and your programs, as well as your direct service provision and supervision of vocational staff, right? Additionally, I want to make sure that I'm emphasizing these community guidelines for our topic today. I want to make sure that this is a knowledge share and safe space. I personally believe, and I know Rutgers believes in co-learning, that everyone in this virtual space has different experiences as well as expertise that we can share. We're going to maintain the utmost respect for the complex and beautiful identities that we all hold in this virtual space, as well as for the individuals that we are working with. We ask that we today lead with curiosity, that we provide a stigma-free zone, and that everyone here can hopefully share, learn, and grow in our provision of culturally relevant, culturally competent services. So what are we doing for today? We're going to look at cultural identity, and specifically this component of race and diversity. Cultural identity, diversity, and specifically this piece on race are at the forefront of many of our national discussions and have been noted in statements from the ACA, right, the American Counseling Association, the APA, as essential areas for practitioner competencies and ethical mental health services, demonstrating cultural humility, a racial justice lens, and appreciation for diversity is critically important in understanding your identity, our biases, and appreciating beauty and value in supporting diverse individuals in service. This session is intended to be introductory and by no means is exhaustive in terms of the content and the topic. This is just touching the surface. So hopefully throughout this session, you might cultivate a curiosity and a desire to explore culture and diversity and in the context of how it's relevant in supporting best practices in mental health service provision and mental health supervision of direct service providers. I think it's important when conducting a training on cultural identity that the facilitator share their positionality to give insight on my cultural lens and what specific cultural identifiers I'm bringing into this session. And this should be done as best practice, and we'll go over this later today, for many of our counseling interactions and relationships. When you share your positionality with clients or people in service, even supervision, this is called broaching. So we'll get into that in a little bit later. So to kind of model this and to demonstrate broaching, I'm going to give you insight into my cultural identities. And as I share with you, you can just kind of think about and prepare for our first exercise together, your cultural lens and your salient cultural identities. So I identify as white.
Hey, baby, how are you? I'm all right.
Oop, I hear some chatting. Hold on one second. Gonna mute that. Sorry about that. So I identify as white. I'm a second generation American. My grandparents were directly from Hungary and Germany. I am a queer female who was raised in a lower socioeconomic status household. I was a first-gen college student, and I frame my counseling services within the context of trauma-informed care, psychiatric rehabilitation, motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral therapy, and critical race theory. So that is kind of a little bit of insight into my cultural lens. When we think about culture and our cultural lens, right, the most basic definition of this piece of cultural identity is a sense of belonging, of connection to a group, right, with a shared lived experience or shared fractals of our identity, as you can see here in this little chart, this beautiful little pie graph. Cultural identity is complex. It is multifaceted, and it is a driving force behind who we are as people. Consider these various facets of culture in relation to your own cultural identity? How do these aspects of your identity intersect? How do they influence your experiences, right? Of living in the US, of being in Washington State? How do they impact your service provision, your supervision of vocational staff, even your conceptualization of services? For counselors and clinical supervisors, it's essential to understand the dynamic nature of cultural identity in all of our exchanges, because all exchanges are multicultural exchanges. And that needs to start with a personal appraisal. And this begins with you, as well as clinical staff members, reflecting without judgment on your own cultural identity and how it influences your decisions, how it influences treatment planning, supervision, interactions, etc. Furthermore, we hold a multitude of identities simultaneously, and those identities carry points of privilege and points of marginalization or oppression, right? This is typically denoted in how congruent or incongruent one's identity is to the dominant cultural group. So for example, I am white, point of privilege. I am queer, potential point of marginalization. I'm a woman, potential point of marginalization, right? So within these facets of my identity, I have points of privilege and potential points of marginalization. So I want you guys to start thinking about this concept and its applicability to your cultural facets. And so we're going to do that by looking at this wheel that explores various cultural facets and privilege. Privilege refers to certain social advantages, benefits, degrees of prestige or respect that an individual has by virtue of belonging to certain social identity groups. Within America, as well as Western societies, these privileged social identities are people who have historically occupied positions of dominance. And this can include being white, being male, being heterosexual, being wealthy, among others. And so I'm going to break you up into groups. And I would like for you, using this privilege checklist that I'm going to be putting in the chat. Okay, that was just sent. This is a privilege checklist, and this is going to help you in your group to look at your points of identity. And you can discuss with your group members to your comfort level these concepts of privilege within social identities and points of marginalization and oppression, right, to your comfort level. And just kind of explore within your groups the applicability of this in working in the field of mental health services and working with individuals within BIPOC communities, BIPOC being Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Any questions before I send you into the breakout group rooms? You can put those in the chat. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. I'm assuming everyone can access the checklist. You can go ahead and open that up. And I'm going to give you about 10 minutes in your breakout group rooms to have a discussion about these salient identities and points of privilege or points of marginalization. Be prepared to chat about it when we get back. Thanks. My apologies, I'm going to start recording again. I shut that off when we were in our groups. So we should never assume. We should always inquire about a person's racial identity and should lead with interest and openness. Moreover, people within the same race will have variances and differences within that racial identity. Additionally, there are many aspects to consider when exploring cultural humility and race within the context of counseling services. So consider how lack of cultural humility of that social justice, racial justice lens can impact wellness and symptoms of mental health conditions. Individuals within BIPOC cultures, right, when we think about what this historically looks like, right, can be significantly impacted. Thinking about the criminal justice system, they're more likely to be arrested and prosecuted for nonviolent offenses such as drug possession. Additionally, right, people within BIPOC communities are more likely to be misdiagnosed, over-medicated, or have improper medications, older medications with more side effects, increased risk for dropping out of services, right? This historically has been high. And we see that historically, a lot of practitioners in the field of various counseling modalities are primarily white. And so dropout of services for BIPOC individuals and individuals within BIPOC communities have been linked to a lack of cultural humility, right? To a lack of service that addresses root causes of presenting problems such as racism, traumatization, racial traumatization, or even experiencing re-traumatization within Eurocentric mental health practices. So we want to be mindful that when we're working with individuals within BIPOC communities and cultures, we are knowledgeable about the things that are impacting them, and we are working in alignment with best practices. So let's take a look in terms of those impacts, right? Racism is a system of advantage based on race that involves systems and institutions, not just individual mindset and actions. The critical variable in racism is the impact, right? The impact, the outcome, not intent of the person. And it operates at multiple levels, including individual racism, interpersonal racism, institutional racism, as well as structural racism. So what are those? Individual racism refers to beliefs, attitudes, and actions of individuals that support or perpetuate racism in conscious and unconscious ways. Our cultural narrative in the US about racism typically focuses on individual racism, and we fail to recognize systemic racism, right? Examples include believing superiority of Caucasian people, not hiring people of color because of whatever bias, even telling racist jokes. Interpersonal racism occurs between individuals and includes public expressions of racism that can often involve bias, hateful words, actions, exclusion, etc. Institutional racism occurs in organizations. These are race-based policies and practices that give unfair advantages to individuals who are white over people of color. These institutional policies often never mention a racial group, but the intent is to create advantages. An example might be a school system where students of color are more frequently distributed, right, to the most crowded classrooms and underfunded schools and out of the highest resourced schools. And then structural racism is the overarching system of racial bias across institutions and society. These systems give privileges to individuals who are white, resulting in disadvantages to people of color or BIPOC individuals. Examples are stereotypes of people of color as criminals, right, in mainstream movies or media. And so what the impact of this racism we can see, right, in terms of that systemic racism, is that it impacts individual social determinants of health, right? Significantly impacts social determinants of health. Scientific evidence shows that significant disparities in health and in healthcare are based on socioeconomic factors of an individual's life. We call these factors, right, the conditions that people are born, grow, live, work, and age, the social determinants of health. And you see those factors here. They account for much as 80% of a person's health outcomes. As you can see, some of these social determinants of health include economic stability, education, right, transportation, etc. We know that race and ethnicity play a significant role in understanding the distribution of someone's social determinants of health. And while in many circumstances, race and ethnicity may be predictive of someone's social determinants of health, it's important to understand that it's racism, right? Racism, and not race as a social construct, right? Racism is a primary driver of diminished social determinants of health. It drives inequality and inequity in housing, income, education, especially among BIPOC communities. In many ways, it's not just one of these social determinants of health, it's an underlying structural determinant that sets the stage for all other social determinants, right? Racism plays a fundamental role in these health outcomes, right? And systemic structural racism can manifest itself as legislative policy, hiring practices, which we as vocational practitioners need to be very mindful of in working with individuals who are of BIPOC communities in our services. Racism ultimately is a driving force in this inequity. And to achieve equity, we must address those injustices in our services to the extent possible. So let's take a closer look at this specific social determinant of health in our domain of employment. The effects of unemployment and underemployment essentially are like ripples in a pond, impacting a person profoundly and pervasively. A person lacking economic stability may have precarious, unmet basic needs like food insecurity, housing instability, inaccessibility to life-saving healthcare. Adverse health outcomes for those facing the challenges of economic instability are catastrophic. People with less economic stability may have initial onset and exacerbation of mental health symptoms, physical health morbidities such as hypertension, right, cardiovascular issues, even increased level of mortality. Chronic unemployment is associated with increased dependence on public health services, stress related to chronic poverty, social isolation, anxiety, depression, right? Unemployment is significantly bad for a person. However, unemployment, underemployment, and subsequent economic instability are not ubiquitous. These experiences disproportionately impact some cultural groups more than others. Economic instability and financial inequality in the US are not neutral. These experiences impact communities of color, BIPOC communities, at disparate rates. As per the US Bureau of Labor and Statistics, a report done in 2021, the unemployment rate for white individuals fell to 3.2%, while those identifying as Asian were unemployed at a rate of 3.8%. Additionally, Latino, Latinx, Hispanic individuals had on average an unemployment rate of 4.9%, while the unemployment rate for Black and African American individuals increased from 6.5% to 7.1%, right? Moreover, the unemployment rate for Indigenous people and Alaskan Natives was 7.9%, right? That's almost twofold the unemployment rate compared to white individuals. And it's a consistent finding. Employment racial disparities are not solely consigned to the rates of unemployment amongst groups. These disparities can be observed in difference in underemployment rates, with wage gaps and the racialization of national poverty rates. BIPOC job seekers have disproportionately worked in positions that mandate manual labor and lower wages. Not only are these jobs physically taxing, but there's a high potentiality for workplace injury, as well as decreased long-term job tenure due to declining physical ability from injury or overuse, right? As people physically may start to decline after a certain age based on these jobs, right? Ultimately, these jobs are not viable as long-term employment solutions. According to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics report in 2020, the highest occupations, right? The highest paying occupational category of management, professional and related occupations comprised of 41% of white employees. Subsequently, there were 32% of Black or African American employees, 23% of Hispanic, Latina, Latinx employees in this particular career, right? Where they earn or have the potential for the highest earnings, right? So BIPOC workers have reduced access to jobs within those potential primary labor markets or high-paying occupations. And that's a significant barrier to economic stability and those enhanced social determinants of health. Additionally, BIPOC residents make up in the US 38% of the population, but account for 52% of those living below the poverty line. Systemic oppression, structural racism, discrimination, and limited resource allocation to these communities contribute to these inequities. And even more disheartening is the impact of these intersecting identities of those within BIPOC communities coupled with a disability. And for us, we're looking at the disability of mental health conditions, right? And how that impacts employment status and earnings. Several studies have found lower employment rates and wages among BIPOC individuals than white individuals in community mental health programs, right? A troubling side effect of this disparity is that the overall wealth gap between white individuals and BIPOC community members has risen to record levels and further widening that divide in social determinants of health for this cultural group. Right? Unfortunately, BIPOC communities are overrepresented among transition age youth and young adults with psych disabilities. The disparities in labor force participation among young adults with psychiatric conditions, mental health conditions, are highest for Black and African American communities, right? So in 2013, there was a 44.5% gap between African Americans, Black individuals with and without a disability in terms of employment. That is significant, right? A national survey found that BIPOC individuals with mental health conditions had lower employment rates than their white counterparts. Moreover, poorer employment outcomes exist for individuals within BIPOC communities than for individuals in white identifying, right, in community mental health programs, which again, significantly contribute to those diminished social determinants of health. And this really emphasizes, subsequently the need for interventions to address these disparities. So what can we do to help address these disparities? What are some best practices? On a micro level, we can look at developing cultural humility to provide competent care for every single individual coming into career and vocational services, especially for individuals within BIPOC communities. We can also look at building cultural humility through the act of broaching, having the conversations about culture and how culture is a point of context and gives information, right, in terms of vocational services and how culture can impact, right, treatment planning, service planning, interventions, etc. So this act of broaching is action in terms of cultural humility. Additionally, helping BIPOC clients enter the primary labor market can assist in helping them to gain financial autonomy. And this can be assisted and supported in helping BIPOC clients enter educational programs, right? Providing supported employment services so that people can get access to that good, right, human capital, that braiding of education and employment experiences. Additionally, we need to validate experiences of racial injustice, racism, structural racism, right? Our invalidation, especially invalidation from white practitioners, is re-traumatization. And it increases dropout rates and it increases overall poorer mental health outcomes, right? So we need to get into the practice of validating these experiences through some of the practices that we're going to be learning about in the next slide, cultural humility. Additionally, we want to look at linking individuals to services that bolster other social determinants of health, housing, food sources, healthcare, good quality healthcare, to get those additional needs met. We also want to look at ourselves and addressing our biases. We want to look at addressing issues of microaggression, microinvalidation within our services, but also supporting individuals within BIPOC communities in addressing these concerns in their workplace setting, right? There are whole trainings on supporting individuals in addressing microaggressions, bias, microinvalidation in the workplace. How do you do it in terms of addressing that potential racism? Additionally, we need to look at supporting advocacy and wellness care for individuals in service, especially within those BIPOC communities. And as a trauma practitioner, I'm always looking at how are we addressing trauma, right? How are we addressing racial trauma and preventing re-traumatization? So let's look a little further at some of these pieces I discussed. First, we have this component of cultural humility. This was first coined in 1998 by healthcare professionals who originally described cultural humility as a tool to educate physicians to work within culturally, ethnically, and racially diverse populations. Their concept, their practice carries over now into so many different healthcare settings, including social work, psychology, counseling, right? And our practice of vocational services. And the concept really helps us to ultimately support people in all of their diversity and to celebrate and acknowledge diversity in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, affectional orientation or identity, socioeconomic status, right? In any cultural context, to support people and to celebrate, right, their culture and the pride that they have in their culture. So taking a little bit of a further look at this piece of cultural humility, right? There are many ways that we can kind of define cultural humility. And I reviewed the definition from the developers. I like how SAMHSA kind of defines it as well, thinking about cultural humility being complex and entails much more than just singular racial identity or ethnicity, but all of these various cultural facets, right? Multiculturalism includes dimensions, including, again, those affectional orientation, gender, social class, etc., and helps to kind of look at knowledge, self-awareness, attitudes, skills, behaviors, and the application of these variables conducive to providing cross-cultural care or service to diverse populations. We identify that cultural humility is not an end product, it's a continuous journey. It's a progression. You never come to an endpoint. You're always developing cultural humility, right? It's an ongoing process of growth because culture itself is always changing, evolving. There's next iterations. Culture is not static, it's dynamic. And so we cannot be a master of cultures. We're always in that student seat, if you will. Right, the journey toward becoming culturally competent requires a beginner's mind, and you're focusing throughout that process on being other-oriented rather than self-focused, having unwavering respect and dignity for others, reducing your ethnocentrism, leading with interest and desire to understand, curiosity, never assuming, and it requires so much action from us as change agents for social justice, especially within the context of racial justice. And there's this piece that's not just about individual action, but it's institutional action, right? Taking on systemic issues. And so a practice that it just really aligns quite nicely with cultural humility is broaching. And that's kind of what I gave you an example of at the start of our session, where I was referring to, right, my particular cultural lens and identifiers, right? So broaching refers to this racial, ethnic, and culture issues that are relevant to the individual in counseling services, vocational services, and they're presenting concerns. Broaching is an invitation to a discussion. It is not a singular discussion. It can be several discussions, and it creates an opportunity to develop a strong therapeutic alliance where differences are acknowledged, right? And ultimately, when you think about broaching, again, I don't want to make it seem like it's just one singular conversation. It's a continuum of conversations, behaviors, attitudes, and a constant awareness of that context of culture. So why do we use it, right? When we look at the research, counselors who have addressed race in counseling using broaching overwhelmingly perceive these conversations to have positive impact on services. Failure to address the issue of race and ethnicity can perpetuate cultural bias by imposing the dominant culture on individuals who might be socially marginalized in services, right? So for me as a white practitioner, I want to be hyper vigilant of practicing broaching and practicing that cultural humility in working with BIPOC communities. Acknowledgement of cultural factors in counseling sessions enhance counselor credibility, enhance client satisfaction, and the depth of disclosure by the individual in services, and willingness to return for follow-up sessions. Remember, we talked about that high dropout rate for individuals within BIPOC communities in counseling services, mental health services. When we broach, when we demonstrate cultural humility, right, we are counteracting the factors that contribute to those dropout rates. Right, this is best practice. A lack of that multicultural competency or humility, again, is a significant impact factor for people terminating services. Elements that are conducive to broaching, right? Things you want to see present to support broaching. You want to have an environment of emotional safety. You want to have consistent attitude of openness, right? When you're practicing that cultural humility, genuine commitment by the counselor, acknowledgement that race may affect presenting problems or may not affect the presenting problem, but to ask the person, right? And to get their perspective, making no assumptions. The recognition of the importance of that relationship with the practitioner, the vocational practitioner, and the job seeker, and use of counseling environment as a safe space, right, to explore this topic, to support them, right, in having discussions outside of the session, maybe for vocational support and success, right? So additional things that we can keep in mind to support our development of cultural humility in our vocational services is first and foremost looking at and exploring with the person their pride and participation in their cultural groups, looking at these points of specific cultural groups, right? Looking at their social skills, traditions, knowledge, and practical skills specific to their culture, learning about their culturally specific ways of self-care, looking at, like, within that cultural context, ability to advocate and address points of marginalization or oppression, managing wellness within experiences of racism, marginalization, and oppression, looking at their community involvement and the support that they have from their cultural communities and pulling that into services, looking at their traditions, their spiritual practices, religious practices, and pulling that into their strengths and person-centered approaches for vocational services. And especially, looking at cultural views on employment, mental health conditions, and treatment for mental health conditions. So again, this is all ways in which we can support these competencies in working with BIPOC communities in vocational services. And lastly, there's this piece on becoming an anti-racist counselor. And this looks at the action continuum, right? To assess where are we at, right? In actively addressing, confronting, being proactive in addressing racism, in addressing points of oppression or marginalization. And this is a great tool that you can utilize with your staff. to look at, right? In terms of how are you developing that anti-racist approach to provide best practice, evidence-based practice with the BIPOC job seekers. So on this continuum, you see actively participating. This could look like telling oppressive jokes, putting people down, intentionally avoiding people, being verbally harassing. Denying is enabling that racism or oppression by denying that people are oppressed, does not actively, in terms of the behavior, is not actively oppressing, but denies that it exists, right? So that's that specific piece on the scale. Recognizing no action is aware that racism and oppressive acts occur by self or others, and their harmful effect, but doesn't take action to stop the behavior. And this inaction could be a result of fear, lack of information, confusion about what to do. Recognizing an action is aware of racism and oppression and recognizes oppressive actions of self and others, and we take action to stop it. Educating self, taking actions to learn more about racism and oppression by reading, attending workshops such as this, cultural events, and joining organizations that oppose racism and oppression. Educating others, moving beyond educating self, right? Sharing with your staff, providing in-services for your staff, adding this to your clinical supervision, right? Service conceptualization, supporting and encouraging, right? That looks like supporting others who speak out against injustices or who are working to be more inclusive of targeted groups. Then we see initiating and preventing, working to change individual and institutional actions and policies that discriminate, working for passage of, right, policies, procedures against discrimination. And then we have just a couple of steps, right, in looking at becoming an anti-racist counselor. And anti-racism is defined as a work of actively opposing racism by advocating for changes in political, economic, social life, right? Anti-racism tends to be an individualized approach and set up in opposition to individual racist behaviors and impacts. So I'm going to, I know I threw a lot out of you, stop here and check for any questions, any comments, any follow-up in terms of developing your best practices and supporting your staff in developing best practice, evidence-based practice, and working with job seekers of BIPOC communities. I see. Thank you for the wonderful training. You're absolutely welcome. Thank you for attending. Great stuff. Thank you. Thank you for attending. It is always appreciated as people are developing their skill sets and competencies. Thank you. Thank you for attending. Any questions in terms of application of content? I know you'll all be receiving the recording. You also will be receiving the PowerPoint. You'll have the privilege questionnaire mailed as well to you, emailed. I want to thank everyone for attending today, for coming and learning about developing your skill sets and competencies in working with diverse populations and working specifically with BIPOC community job seekers. If you do have any questions or comments that you think of later, please feel free to email me. My information should be available on the flyer as well as on the PowerPoint slides. But thank you so very much. I will stop the recording